Today we're going to get into the Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus' sermon on the end times. And Jesus gave one of the most detailed, clearest teachings on this and the timing of the rapture. So let's just dive right in. Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now, this probably wasn't major news to the disciples. You must understand Jewish eschatology at the time. They believed that their temple would be destroyed in a time of tribulation right up before their Messiah. All right, and they got this from the prophet Daniel, who wrote about the people of the prince who is to come destroying the city and the sanctuary. So they were probably familiar with this passage. So when they ask in the next verse, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Now you can understand why they made the connection that the temple would be destroyed when Jesus came, and why they believed that that would be the end of the age. So they were not asking three different questions. In their minds, the destruction of the temple and the return of the Lord would take place at the same time, which would be at the end of the age. It's also very important to remember that Jesus, being a prophet, followed in the tradition of the prophets who came before him, so he gave prophecies that had a near distant dimension to them. Remember, we talked about in the previous video, and I demonstrated how prophecies can have a dualistic nature to them. So when Jesus mentioned the destruction of the temple, he was telescoping and applying the prophecy to their generation, but he was also applying it to the distant future. Now let's go on in verse 4. And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." If the disciples were wrong in their thinking about the temple being destroyed at the end of the age, when Jesus returns in glory, then why did Jesus not correct their thinking? This would have been a perfect place to say, "Well, hold on a second, let me correct your thinking real quick." You can tell from his response that he had something far more cataclysmic and final in mind than AD 70. Why did Jesus immediately get into warning about false messiahs and deception if the answer to their question was just about AD 70? He goes on in verse 6, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains." Now let me show you Luke's account of this so we can get a clearer picture. "Then he said to them, 'Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and pestilences. And there will be terrors and great signs from heaven.'" When Jesus says they should not be alarmed by wars and rumors of wars, because the end is not yet, it's clear Jesus was indeed speaking about the end of the age. So Jesus was not just limiting this prophecy to AD 70, even if the temple was destroyed, even if Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. The final day of the Lord, the end, is in view here, and AD 70 was not the end of the age, and it certainly wasn't anything that transitioned us into the day of the Lord. Now Luke mentions famines and pestilences, terrors, and great signs from heaven. This shows that the earthquakes, famines, pestilences, terrors, and great signs from the heavens that we read about in the seal, trumpet, and bowl judgments will be experienced by the church. Notice also that Christ specifically mentions the persecution of his people for his namesake. This proves the Olivet Discourse is indeed addressed to Christ's followers. The Jewish people are not persecuted for Christ's name's sake. Going on in verse 9, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." And here's what Luke says, "But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake." Notice that Jesus did not say you'll be raptured and rescued from death. No, he says the opposite. They're going to deliver you up to tribulation. You're going to be killed for my name's sake. And the use of the word you means he's talking to his followers. The Jews don't get killed for the name of Christ. So this discourse is not just about the nation of Israel. Pre-tribbers argue all the time that this whole sermon is just to the Jews and not the church. Well, if that's true, the same hermeneutic would have to be applied to the Great Commission, where Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." Was that only to the Jews? So we can't just say a passage is to a certain group of people when we want it to be, and then apply a different hermeneutic to other passages we want as our own. Now, verse 10, "And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another." And then Luke's version, "You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death." When Jesus says many will fall away, this is further proof that Jesus is talking about Christians. Jesus was not talking about Jewish people falling away from the Jewish faith. No, he just said people would be killed and persecuted for his name. So the falling away here is a falling away from the Christian faith. This is the same apostasy that the Apostle Paul mentioned in 2 Thessalonians. It's something that Paul said must happen before the return of the Lord Jesus and before we gather back to him. If you remember from part 5 of this series, I talked briefly about the Greek word apostasia that was translated falling away. Now, a small minority of pre-tribbers believe this word could be translated departure, as in a departure from the earth in a rapture. But there is no evidence, there is no Greek literature where this word is ever used in that way. It is always used to mean a departure from the faith or to leave one's country and be a traitor. So if you want to believe this word means to leave the planet in a rapture, then you can go right ahead and do some bad eisegesis. Just go ahead and insert your own ideas into the text, because that's not what it says. Now, verse 11, "And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." Now, Luke says it this way, "You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives." Jesus' call to endure to the end doesn't make very much sense if the church gets raptured before things get bad. When Jesus said, "Not a hair of your head will perish," he was obviously not talking about physical death, because he just said, back in verse 10, that some of them would be put to death even by their own relatives. So which one is it? Are we going to be killed, or not a hair of our head perish? Well, we know there can be no contradiction, so it's a matter of interpreting this correctly so there's harmony. Jesus is talking about perishing in the lake of fire. He's talking about perishing by God's wrath. Yes, we will be killed physically, but our spirit will live eternally. We won't perish spiritually. That's what he's talking about. And that is the wrath Paul said we are not destined for. And I know what some of you are saying. Jesus wouldn't beat his bride by making her go through the tribulation. Well, let's think about that. Like I said in the previous video, what do you think the apostles think of that statement, considering how they all died brutal deaths? What about all the Christians that were turned into Roman candles, which is when Christians would be burned alive and the light of the fire would illuminate the streets? What about the Christians fed to lions? Was Jesus beating on them? And why is our generation so different that we don't have to go through those atrocities? So the pre-tribbers need to explain, if the rapture has been imminent all this time, why did they have to get beat up on by Jesus? Why was Jesus feeding them to lions? What is so different about our time now that's so different than their time? Remember, the early Christians were in the last days just like we're in the last days. And our last days are not different from their last days. Just because we're separated by 2,000 years, that doesn't mean we're in some different dispensation. It's the same last days, and we will experience the same last days tribulation they experienced. But we will not experience God's eschatological wrath that comes at the parousia, which comes at the day of the Lord, which is not the tribulation. Now, going on in Matthew. Verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Notice he didn't say, and this gospel of the Jewish people will be preached just to the Jewish people here in this little geographical location, and then the end will come in AD 70. No, the end Jesus is talking about is the end of the age, which has been the subject of the whole sermon. But he's saying the gospel must go to the ends of the earth before Jesus comes back. And according to the Joshua Project, there are a lot of unreached people groups in the world. So we're not as close as we think. So if we aren't close today when it comes to reaching people with the gospel, they certainly weren't close back in AD 70. So Jesus' prophecy has to reach into the distant future. It has to go beyond AD 70. Now, going on in verse 15. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Notice Christ is still using the pronoun you to indicate that his followers would still be on the earth to see the abomination of desolation. Like I said in the previous video, this shows how prophecies could have fulfillments in multiple generations. The abomination of desolation did take place historically when Antiochus Epiphanes set up an image of Zeus in the temple. Jesus, however, took that prophecy and applied it to the very end of the age. So you may want to go back and watch part 7 of this series if you want to know more about what I'm talking about. Now, another big question that usually comes up here is how to understand the holy place that Jesus just mentioned. Contrary to how some spiritualize and allegorize Scripture, we know the physical temple in Jerusalem is in view here, because the holy place refers to the inner sanctuary where they placed the lampstand and the table of showbread. Furthermore, Paul also taught this exact same truth when he wrote, "For that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, the apostasy, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." Paul was not using the word temple here in a spiritual sense as he did in other places when he spoke of the church. You see, the mistake some people make is they see a metaphor used in one way, and then they assume that the author uses it the same way everywhere else. Context has to be considered, and in this case, the context demands a literal physical temple. A large portion of Scripture would have to be spiritualized to make this temple the church. You'd have to throw out all of Daniel's prophecies, and this is what I call butchering the text. Eisegesis. You're inserting your own ideas rather than exegeting, taking out of the text what it says. Now, Luke's account makes it obvious that a literal temple is being talked about because he mentions armies surrounding Jerusalem. Here's what Luke writes. "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written." If Jesus and Paul were referring to the temple of his body, the church, then wouldn't Luke say the armies would surround Rome, Italy, where the Vatican is? Well, that doesn't really work either, does it? Because what spiritual temple would the Roman armies be surrounding in Luke's account? Now, when you put Luke's account together with Matthew and Mark, you have a more complete picture. Jesus understood from the book of Daniel that the Antichrist will surround Jerusalem with his armies and set up an image of himself in the temple, or the holy place, demanding worship. So he telescopes the prophecy. The Antichrist will destroy the temple, fulfilling Christ's warning that not one stone will be left upon another. This must mean that a future temple will be rebuilt. Now, here's a crucial thing you need to hear. We know from Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy that the abomination of desolation will take place at the midpoint of the last week. This is significant because if Jesus said that we'd see the abomination of desolation, and if it comes at the midpoint of what pre-tribbers themselves call the tribulation, then how can there be a pre-tribulation rapture? Further proof that this prophecy will find its ultimate fulfillment at the very end of history is when Jesus said, "For these are days of vengeance." Where have we heard that before? All of the things Jesus just mentioned were part of the vengeance of God, which puts all of these signs in the time period leading right up to the day of the Lord. These signs will fulfill the prophetic scriptures concerning the day of vengeance. This means that the church is not going to be raptured before the day of the Lord. If Jesus meant for his Olivet sermon to be fulfilled entirely in AD 70, then why say that the abomination of desolation and Jerusalem being surrounded by armies would fulfill all that is written? Surely no one thinks AD 70 was the fulfillment of all prophecy. Now let's go on in verse 17 of Matthew 24. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in the house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Now let's look at Luke's version. Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Notice how Jesus states that after the abomination of desolation is set up in the holy place, then there will be great tribulation. It is here, at the midpoint of the last week of Daniel's prophecy, that the great tribulation begins. So the great tribulation is not 7 years, but 3.5. But perhaps Jesus in his mercy will cut it short. But this at the very least rules out a pre-trib rapture. Jesus states that this tribulation will be unlike anything the world has ever seen. He probably had Daniel 12:1 in mind, which says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time." How AD 70 can be the ultimate fulfillment of this, I have no idea. Yes, AD 70 was terrible. History shows us that. But what Jesus is predicting here will be unlike anything in history. And Christians will be on the earth and not in heaven at this point, which rules out a pre-tribulation rapture. And think about it this way too. Luke mentions the diaspora. So Jesus is covering all of the church age here. He is saying that the Jewish people will be killed and taken captive among all the nations of the world until the Gentiles have had their time to come into the fold. To mention the Jewish diaspora proves Jesus was not merely talking about AD 70. He knew that there would be a great period of time before he came back to set up his kingdom. So these prophecies will find their final resolution right before the day of the Lord and during the day of the Lord. Now, for the sake of time, let's skip down to verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now here's Luke's version. And there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken. If you watched the previous video in the series, then you know what these signs signal: the day of the Lord. That means at this point, the rapture is imminent. That's why Jesus' very next words are, "Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." See, this is the rapture. We've already talked at length about how Paul connected the day of the Lord to the rapture. So for Jesus to place the gathering of the elect here after the cosmic signs associated with the day of the Lord, that can only mean one thing. Jesus taught a post-tribulation day of the Lord rapture. And notice too that Jesus says the cosmic signs come after the tribulation of those days. The signs of the day of the Lord and the rapture come after the tribulation. We know this is the rapture because Jesus uses the very same descriptive terms that Paul used when writing about the church being caught up to meet the Lord in the air. We learn from this passage that it is the angels of God that gather Christ's people at the sound of a trumpet. This is the same trumpet mentioned by the Old Testament prophets who wrote about the day of the Lord, and the same trumpet mentioned by Paul. That means that the rapture Paul was speaking of in those passages is the actual glorious appearing of Christ, not a secret rapture 7 years prior. And think about this. Luke only mentions signs in the sun, moon, and stars, but he does not specifically mention the darkening of the heavenly bodies. This shows that Luke interpreted these cosmic signs as literal phenomena. To spiritualize the sun and moon to represent governmental powers or even demonic powers would be a careless interpretation, when Luke clearly thought these signs would literally take place in the sun, moon, and stars. Now, where Jesus mentions the roaring of the sea and waves, we know from the book of Revelation that the earth will be bombarded by cosmic debris as God pours out his judgments during the first 4 trumpet judgments. This would certainly cause tsunamis and the roaring of the sea and waves. Isaiah records that the earth will be moved out of its place, and this could be one of the natural phenomena that causes this. But the mention of these cosmic signs helps us place the timing of the 6th seal in Revelation in the sequence of events. Since the same signs are mentioned, it is safe to assume that the 6th seal signals the coming day of the Lord. In other words, the 6th seal signals the coming of the Son of Man, or the rapture of the church. But the big thing you've got to see here is that when Jesus mentions these cosmic signs, that lets us know the rapture is getting ready to take place. We know this because Paul connected the day of the Lord with the rapture. So when you put Paul's teachings with Jesus' teachings, you see that the rapture takes place after the tribulation, right at the beginning of the day of the Lord. Jesus taught a post-tribulation rapture. And a lot of people say, oh no, this is describing the glorious appearing. The rapture takes place 7 years prior. Well, where does it say that? All throughout this passage is talked about you will be delivered up to be killed, you'll be killed, you'll be killed, you'll be persecuted, they'll deliver you up to tribulation. Oh, well, that's just talking to the Jews, not the Christians. Well, we just showed how he said that people would be killed for his name's sake. That can't be the Jewish people. So you've got to read the text, and when you do it with an open mind, you'll see that Jesus taught a post-tribulation rapture.